Hello, and welcome to Starfinder Wednesday. I'm Jason Keeley, a Starfinder developer, and I'm here today with Rob McCreary, our creative director.
Hello.
Yes, that was the Attack of the Swarm AP trailer. I just love the heck out of that thing.
That is really cool.
And that's what we're here to talk about. We're going to talk about a little bit about the Attack of the Swarm AP, but we're mostly going to focus on Swarm lore, where they came from, what they're like, what they're made out of, all that sort of thing. And in case you don't know, we'll just sort of give you a brief overview. The Swarm are one of our sort of big threats of the Starfinder setting. They are these interstellar locusts that just basically eat everything. They have this hive mind. They're very insectile. They're constantly, they basically overrun you, and just like that's why they have the name the Swarm. They're sort of endless and uncountable and deadly. Wouldn't you agree, Rob?
I would indeed agree.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's just one of those things that you can just that we wanted to be sort of this, galactic threat that could strike anywhere in the galaxy and be a danger to anyone, whether in the Pact worlds or some other heretofore unheard of system like Sub-colonies,
Yeah,
for example.
Exactly. So you're saying what we wanted it to be. You were very instrumental on creating Starfinder setting from the basically the ground up. When we were making the core rulebook, talk a little bit about like the influences, why we picked the Swarm, why they are all insectile, what sort of other bits of popular culture that might have informed their look and their mien, so to speak.
Yeah, well, of course, like the locust swarm is something that's, what goes way back in Earth history and stories and everything. So that makes a lot of sense. And of course, from science fiction, it's a trope it's entered to science fiction a lot. Owen Stevens and I, who's worked on Starfinder, we were both really influenced by Starship Troopers, the Robert A. Heinlein novel, and which of course has people in power armor fighting giant bugs. There's another book that both he and I read called Armor by John Stakely. It's in the inspirations list in the Starfinder core rulebook, and we were both kind of surprised to find someone else who had read this book before. But it's also dealing with these alien insects and humans fighting this big onslaught. So. And there's lots of other places, of course, where these kind of things have shown up, but we really wanted to get something in there, and that just felt like something that would be just a cool thing, just something that just devours entire planets and solar systems and just keeps moving and is virtually unstoppable.
All right, they are, and basically, the adventure path is going to take that into account, what they're doing and where they came from, maybe a little bit, and how to put an end to their menace. But they do have a history. They're not just sort of out of nowhere, and they have an essentially, like, we talk about this, and you can read it in the core rulebook, but there is there used to be, so to talk about it, started eons, millions of years ago, there was an insectile race known as the Kucharns, and they had a small planet that, had different hives, basically, on there, sort of competing for resources, occasionally going to war like you do any sort of normal planet full of different civilizations. And it didn't seem like they were be any threat until they developed a way to sort of absorb the DNA of their foes and other creatures that they had eaten. And doing that the entire planet essentially became one great big hive mind, right?
And it was like a one smaller hive, right, that first did that. There were all these different hives on this planet, and one of them somehow developed this ability to absorb the DNA and knowledge of other things. And so they basically went and just absorbed all of the other hives on that planet and then turned them into the one big collective.
Right. And then they just basically sort of ate up all the resources on that particular planet, constantly sort of expanding, making themselves more and more until they couldn't fit essentially on there. And they broke off, they sort of, using the force of their combined intelligences, were able to make some biomechanical ships, and were able to get off of their own planet and sort of eat up the rest of the system. But they probably would have maybe just even stayed there had not eventually something had happened with a certain interstellar way of travel coming along with the drift, enabling them to basically move outside of their own system, like along with many of other societies and civilizations in the setting. And unfortunately for the rest of the galaxy, it brought the Swarm along as well.
And those biomechanical starships you were talking about, those are, I think we'll get a little bit more into that later, but it's really, those were actual swarm creatures that they designed one type of swarm creature to be a starship. It's not like they made a new starship that was partially living. It's like they made a new swarm creature that was a starship.
But multiple creatures, so all working together and blasting off into space. A couple of things also about their history, which I find very interesting, which we delve into a bit in the adventure path, is their relationship to Hylax, the insect goddess of sort of peace and diplomacy and first contact. She was one of their patrons, or at least one of their hive's patrons at some point. But then she looked upon what happened, and she was just sort of, I guess, shook her head kind of sadly and went to and said, she while she is a sort of a bug of hive-minded creatures, she is she does look what's the word I'm looking for? Give out sort of independence. She's
right, self-determination.
She's for self-determination and independence. So she said, "Well, I'm just going to let this play out and see where it goes." It's sad. She got saddened by it, but essentially those Kushan turned away from Hylax, and because they became more about devouring each other in war than they were about peace and diplomacy. But it all came sort of back around sort of like, I guess, millennia later. It happened during the gap. No one's really sure when it exactly happened or how it exactly happened. A particular bit of swarm kind of gained a bit of independence and self-thought to become what we now know are the Shirans, the bug people that are one of our core races. And thanks to the sort of what happened during the gap and the sort of confusion that happens after the gap ended, the Shiran were actually able to break away from the swarm, right, and flee a bit. They got off them one of those little small ships, and then they eventually themselves got their own drift engines and were able to escape, and eventually made their way to the Pack Worlds, and with the warning of the swarm is coming. And eventually they did, didn't they?
That's right. Yeah. What 20 years or so before the current setting, the swarm arrived at the Pact Worlds and the Veskarium at the same time. And at this point, the Pact Worlds and the Veskarium were engaged in the so-called Silent War, which was kind of like a Cold War between them, and they realized that they had to band together to defeat the Swarm Menace, and that kind of set up the current political situation in Starfinder, where the Pact Worlds and the Veskarium are allied together when they had been enemies, because they had to come together to fight this common foe. But of course, because that was the reason that brought them together, there's still tensions between them. So it's kind of, the swarm is kind of something that's got bits and pieces sort of all throughout the game in terms of their connection with Hylax as one of the core gods of the setting, their connection to Shiran with one of the core races of the setting, and of course, just in the recent history of the setting itself. Yeah. There's all these sort of ties that all go back to the swarm, because they are a major faction in the galaxy.
Indeed, yeah, that's really the reason why we wanted to get to having them be a sort of a main baddie and an AP. And it has been a couple years since Starfinder's come out, so we figured it was about time that we showcased what they were like and what fighting them was like, to give this sort of move them out of the background per se, and that is sort of a looming threat into a more direct threat to players and whatnot.
Yeah, take it from the history into the present.
Yeah, exactly. I want to grab a question real quick, because it's going to lead us into the next bit. I think we can talk about Lava Being is sort of asking about that they're big bugs, and how large do they actually get? Are the larger bugs used to transport smaller bugs from planet to planet? Does the swarm use tools and technology, or specialized species as tools? So the swarm biology is pretty interesting, and if you get the first volume of Attack of the Swarm, Fate of the Fifth, we have a whole article on there written by one of our editors, Lou Pelizar, who goes into a lot of about the ecology and what they're like and their history. So this is sort of a more detailed look at who and what they are. But indeed, the swarm, they can get big. I'll tell you this much. You're going to find out how big they can get by the end of Attack of the Swarm, for sure. You're going to see, for the most part, they're going to get mostly sort of up to our creature sizes, ones that we fight, but they get even bigger than that with starships, because they come together in one big starships. And you're going to see actually what are what we're calling extractor imagos or imagos. I'm not really sure. I think it's imagos, which are just basically huge ticks the size of buildings that suck a planet dry of their resources, and you're gonna get to see one of those in action, and maybe even crawl inside it and sabotage it from within in one of the adventures. And that's one of the more exciting sort of set piece battles that happens in, like, I think it's the third volume. So that's something to look forward to. But indeed, so that sort of answers your question about whether or not do they use tools? No, they're all about biomechanical stuff. They create their own tools. Anything like a weapon is grafted onto them and organically shoots acid, for instance.
And those things like those acid cannons are like basically swarm things
Things, yeah, yeah.
themselves a lot of times,
Yeah.
because it's like I guess when we should talk about sort of the individual
Right.
swarm are components.
Right. That's what the name of the devised to call them instead of just creatures. We just specifically an individual swarm is known as a component.
But a swarm component can be like a insectile creature that you're fighting that's, you know, human sized. It can be a starship. It can be like a battery, or it's all specialized for what they need. They create it biomechanically or biogenetically to make these things. So they're not going to pick up a weapon off the ground because they'll just make their own.
Yeah, exactly. And as they sort of create, I guess, what they need by often taking the DNA of the places where they're attacking, creatures from that plants, anything that basically they can get their teeth on, and claws and pincers and whatnot. They'll sort of absorb the DNA and take that back to sort of a hive mind situation where they'll have particular swarm components that analyze that sort of thing and decide whether or not, hey, is this useful or not. So they'll adapt themselves for the terrain that they're in, that they're attacking, or the enemy that they're fighting after a while. Because we have in Alien Archive 2, we have Mind Reapers, which have these little like spikes that sort of stick in your brain and take your memories and whatnot, and they'll use that information against you later on, or against your people, because you're probably dead.
Probably by that time.
Probably that point you're dead. So basically, there's no swarm biology there's no swarm queen that we know of, so to speak. So it seems that they reproduce in any number of ways. They're basically sort of eggs and egg sacs that get programmed by these little mosquito-like components known as swarm programmers, and they'll just basically fly around and inject the appropriate DNA sequences and whatnot into the eggs to birth, say, a Korvox or a Thresher Lord or any of the other ones that you're going to see. So indeed, I think someone asked on the forums, are there aquatic swarm? We don't have any statted up currently because we didn't need them for the adventures, but we're going to see that if they are fighting a world that's mostly underwater, you're going to see aquatic swarm. That's just the way they work.
Right, just like we have flying swarms, some that don't fly.
Right, some are psychically gifted.
Right, or just like the starship ones can obviously live without atmosphere and that kind of stuff. So there would be swarm components for virtually any type of environment.
Right, and this was become an interesting sort of thing that as we started this adventure path, I noted we had basically 3 swarm creatures and a swarm starship in Alien Archive 1 and 2, and we didn't, we knew that they could change themselves up and mix up their DNA, but we didn't really have like any thoughts about yet what made them what made them a group, what made them the same as each other, similar to each other. So I had to basically sit down and look at what they could do and what traits they already had, and come up with what was essentially sort of a swarm racial traits, which means and it's not too much. They've got the swarm mind ability, which helps them hive mind to telepathically talk to one another. They've got immunity to acid, because I think just the first 2 or 3 had that, and we just sort of kept that going forward. But, just because a lot of them spit acid, so we figured why not make them immune to acid, and immunity to fear, because they don't feel that, right?
Yeah.
If you're throwing wave after wave of creatures at the enemy, you can't feel fear. They don't break. They don't have morale. They don't care whether or not they die.
Right, because they don't have individuality.
Yeah, exactly.
They are there to serve a specific purpose for the hive, and that purpose may be fight until you die.
Right,
and that's what they do. So yeah.
It came down to the sort of the way the system works, the way the games work. We kind of picked the first couple ones were monstrous humanoids. Right, they kind of have 2 arms and 2 legs for the most part, and so all swarm are technically monstrous humanoids by the rules. That even though the ones that don't look like humanoids, we've got more coming up. We've got them coming up, and that kind of look more like beetles. There is one that sort of is able to convey other smaller swarm components inside of it, like a tank. But it looks like a big sort of beetle-y thing. But it technically is a monstrous humanoid. That's just sort of an artifact of how we wanted to make them all one thing, one species, for lack of a better word. Bob,
So
you want to say some things? I've been talking a lot.
That's true. No, I mean, we, like you said, we've done, so far in every Alien Archive, we've done the hardback Alien Archives. We've done 3 of those now. So we've done new swarm creatures in those books, but all through this, the Attack of the Swarm Adventure Path, we've also added more swarm creatures,
That's right.
more swarm components, because there's just a huge number of them. Do you have a particular favorite swarm component?
Right now, I have one that I do like is called the Swarm Nauphage, Nau phage, and it is sort of the swarm that it was built to sort of mess with actual mechanical stuff for on civilizations that have that sort of thing. So it's one of its hands is basically like a multi-tool, and it's got an organic kind of like sack where it keeps things. So the art is really great in that you can kind of see through it a little bit, and you can see it's got like a data pad in there, and it basically had this like pocket. I think that one's pretty neat.
Cool.
I mean, I don't know if you flipped through any of them yet, or the ones we have in archives.
I actually we haven't statted them up because they're not really combatants, but the programmers that you were talking about are cool, and the generator drones, which are kind of used to like feed other swarm creatures that maybe are like too big to actually eat regular food. So these little generator drones are kind of like beetles that'll just absorb energy from a planet and then transfer it to other members of the swarm and power that kind of stuff. So it's kind of like those are both very like tool-like swarm components that we have cool art for that we show off in this swarm article in Fate of the Fifth. But they're not really statted up, but they're just kind of cool. It's showing like besides just the scary ones that you fight, the sort of day-to-day utilitarian swarm components.
Indeed, there though in volume 6 there is basically a cloud of those swarm programmers that just come at you at one point. So as you get to a place where there are a bunch of eggs ready to hatch, so they can be scary as well in mass, right? But they're basically meant to be just tools. And that kind of brings me to the next thing that we want to talk about, naming them. Like swarms don't have names for themselves. They don't necessarily think like, oh, that's a Korvox, that's Korvox 27, or that's Korvox Bob.
I'm a Mind Reaper.
Right, They don't think that way about themselves because they, again, sort of don't have that individuality. So it basically sort of comes down to, and you'll notice that, we've got names like Mind Reaper, and we have names like Korvox and Nauphage, which have sort of, weird roots to them. In setting, the names kind of come from the people that encounter them. It's just like, oh no, oh, there's this guy, he's coming out, and he's got a bunch of blades, and he's tall, he's big, let's call him a Thresher Lord, right? But when we, coming up with naming them, I always, going through Attack of the Swarm, picking between that and picking kind of like, when I had a talk with Sutter about when the first Alien Archive came out, what to name them, because we had some other names for them from the Freelancer, and we sort of talked about this acid cannon person, and we're like, acidy, we don't use that word, so we kind of got to word corrosion, which is where Koro comes from, and then Vox, because they kind of have that sort of psychic mind blast ability. So we kind of mushed that together, right? So that voice, right? So yeah, there's a little bit of Latininess in there, but that's something that happens a little bit from time to time. And I like to pick out if I've named a swarm and it sounds like a Pokemon name, I think it's a good job. If it kind of sounds like that could also be a Pokemon.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I kind of like the different versions of the names. It's almost like some is like, oh, it was probably some soldier on the battlefield that gave it some flavorful name. And then the other ones that sound more pseudoscientific, that it's like clearly someone was like dissecting one in a lab. Exactly. And it's like, well, this is clearly a swarm Vorphocyte or what? Vorphoma. Yeah. Or they gave it some obviously scientific sounding name. So you have these kind of two different ones. And of course, like you said, the swarm doesn't call themselves that at all. Swarm is swarm.
Swarm is swarm. I had a thought about that first and I've forgotten it. But that's fine.
Well, besides the new swarm creatures that are in the adventure path, we also have some swarm troops.
Oh, yes.
Correct. So
that's right. Talk about troop.
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't familiar with troops, this is basically a way that we have to represent like a large number of creatures of the same type on the battlefield that you fight as a unit. We originally did this concept in first edition Pathfinder for the Reign of Winter adventure path, which I was working on at the time. And in that adventure path, and this is a little bit of a spoiler if you haven't played that, but I'm going to go anyways. You go to Earth during World War I, and so we needed something to represent hordes of Russian soldiers, and so Brandon Hodge, one of our writers, actually created the troop. I guess subtype. Yeah, it's a troop subtype as a way to. It's almost like almost like a swarm, not swarm capital S,
Okay,
but
swarm.
the swarm type in terms of a swarm of creatures that it inhabits an area and kind of moves around, but is usually made up of, larger creatures like humanoids or whatever. And that was kind of where that initially came from. It got picked up and done with more stuff in Pathfinder, but I think it here is the first time we've brought troops into Starfinder, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That kind of came to me a little bit later than I would have liked, to be perfectly honest. As we were plotting this out, I was just like, oh yes, this is a war thing and it's going to happen here and there. And then like some of the first turnover started to come in from like, the first couple volumes. And then it hit me. I was like, oh, we had that troop subtype. We should be doing swarm troops later, at some point to get that feel that you're fighting a war. But we managed to get, I turned to Rob basically. I was like, can you write these like over the next couple of weeks real quick? And turn that over. You did turn that over pretty quick, and we got them into the third volume. So that subtype comes into play a fair amount during the adventure path from then on out, when the PCs have sort of gained a bit more experience and can actually sort of use their abilities to fight larger groups of creatures at a time. But they're definitely going to hopefully make for some real exciting cinematic moments when you've got those like you fight in the first volume dredgers, which are little almost tremors like graboids that kind of go underground and pop up behind the enemy embankments and attack. But you fight a couple of those, but then like later on, maybe like I think it's in the third volume, you actually fight a troop of them, and so it hopefully becomes a cinematic moment where you're just blazing away with your machine guns and whatnot, just taking out these little guys left and right.
And while you're not killing individual members of a troop, they still occupy a big area, which means that you fight like one troop and you're going to throw down 16 pawns or minis on the table.
Know, right?
That's one creature made up of 16 pawns. So it's always great just to see players react to that when you're like, oh, that's one creature.
That's one creature, yeah. And when you have to fight two of them at once, then it becomes a real mess. Hopefully your players will survive this.
It's exciting on the table.
It's exciting indeed. I almost lost my phone there. So one of the things that we sort of didn't mention yet is sort of how the swarm work and what their goals are, whatnot. They break themselves off into what we call sub-colonies, right? And that sub-colony is the one that fought the Vescarium and the pack. Well, it might have been two actually, but that's the one sub-colony, sort of a almost independent thing, because that their hive mind doesn't necessarily stretch across galactic boundaries. So these subcolonies will break off and do a thing, right? They're programmed to, we need to go attack this system to get A, B, and C, get more resources and expand. But those subcolonies are constantly moving around, and there's no one sort of like main colony, right? They're just sort of always nomadic and always constantly on the move, and you can kind of encounter them just about anywhere, which makes them a great enemy for any sort of your home campaigns or what have you. If you need to have a random encounter in space, just come across some swarm that are frontline, advanced scout party for something else. This particular Antagla swarm, this particular subcolony, has a very specific agenda that has to do a little bit with Sheeran history and Sheeran culture and the worship of Hylax. I don't want to spoil it too much, but you'll probably know that the last volume is titled "The God Host Ascends." So there's something a little bit of definitely why your players will need to stop the swarm and attack the swarm, because otherwise it'll be just, not only will your home planet get eaten and you'll die, but maybe even the entire galaxy.
But can you truly defeat the swarm?
I don't know. That's the thing. Pessimists say you cannot, and it's just a matter of time before they devour us all. I for one, welcome our new swarm overlords.
And that's the thing, though, because usually one particular group is only dealing with a single subcolony of the swarm. So even if like the Pact Worlds and the Vescarium defeated the swarm that was attacking them, that was not the swarm. That was subcolonies of the swarm. There are other subcolonies in the galaxy
somewhere else.
Very, very hard to wipe out completely.
Indeed. So one of the reasons too is because they're constantly multiplying. And they're constantly just devouring resources from a planet and just making more of themselves to go somewhere else. And just their main goal is just to eat everything. They don't really have this like, oh, I want to have power over people. No, they just want to destroy everything that's organic. And I suppose in a way that'll be the end of them as well eventually, because they won't have
eventually.
Maybe they'll turn on each other. Who knows? But that's a dark future in which to think about.
And that's one of the things that makes them such a like a scary foe too, is because you can't really reason with them or try to sign a peace treaty, because every other living thing is just a threat or a resource to the swarm to either be destroyed or consumed and absorbed, basically, or take the good parts of your DNA, you know, to do that.
Well, that's a sort of a one thing that we can talk about a little bit, just real quick, about the difference between sort of other swarm-like creatures, right? That maybe in other IPs, the swarm don't infest you. They don't take you over, right? They eat you, and maybe they use your DNA if they think it's good enough. But for the most part, you're not going to necessarily find a human that's got like a swarm beetle on the back of its neck that's controlling it like a puppet. That's not the swarm tactic. Well, maybe not. Yeah, maybe a swarm sub-colony will get that idea and try that out. That's a sort of a threat that we for other species and stuff like body snatcher slimes and stuff like that. But for the most part, the swarm are just going to eat your face. So they don't do that. We had a little bit. I was talking with at one point with Ron Lundeen, the author of our 6th adventure, and that's the adventure in which you return to Sub-colonies to sort of take it back. And we kind of talked back and forth a little bit about, well, maybe someone that they like happen to meet in the first adventure, second adventure, gets possessed by some swarm, you know, or taken over by some swarm biology. And we talked it over a little bit, and obviously this would have been unique and would have had a big deal about it, but we decided against it eventually. So but it's more but there's no lack of things to fight and things to do in these particular adventures. And that sort of brings me to a question that I did see up on the forums earlier about, like, you know, this is a war-based adventure. There's going to be lots of fighting. Your soldiers and your operatives and whatnot are going to have a lot to do and a lot of times to shine. But this doesn't mean that it's just an only fighting AP, because it has to deal with Shirin culture and Hylaxian tenets. There's actually some bit of quietness that somewhere around the middle of the adventure where you are basically in a monastery that is testing you in the ways of Hylax. So you're actually going to have to like talk to people and try to maybe broker peace between two warring factions or do some kind of first contact. So there are some time, especially if for reflective moments in a sort of role-playing sense, there's drift travel enough that you'll be spending, you know, a week or two in the drift so that your players can really like, well, we really just barely made it off that planet alive, and the swarm of, you know, attacked us. So let's take a moment to sit back and think about the horrors of war.
And of course, there's, you know, as part of this swarm invasion, there's also like helping civilians escape and dealing with refugees and that kind of stuff. So it's not just all combat all the time. It's not just all combat all the time. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that I did yesterday, I want to get to this. But basically, that's the sort of most of the swarm lore in a nutshell. Is there anything else you want to add about swarm lore?
Do the swarm live in one particular place?
Do they live in one particular place? That's a good question. They are very nomadic. We don't necessarily have blocked out any kind of that space, swarm occupied space. They consume a planet, they get all of its resources, and then they basically leave.
Yeah, so it's not like they're really holding territory in like the Swarm Kingdom or isn't anything like that. Yeah. But there is a mention though of one system that for some reason the swarm avoids, called Yebion. Yeah. And it's one of those things that we've just kind of thrown in there. And it's like, this is a kind of a big mystery. Why has the swarm not attacked that? What is it about that? And I think that there's even a little thing that
other travelers have gone to Yebion, but not have
to try to find back. Like is the secret to defeating the swarm there, but none of them have ever returned. So there's kind of some interesting little things. It's like they can be anywhere except that one place that seems like they're avoiding for some reason.
Right. So that is another mystery that we kind of dangle in front for your GMs out there if you want to take that mystery and answer it in your home setting. Do we have an answer? We might. But we're not going to say it right here. It's just we know things that about the setting that other people don't, because we create it. But sometimes we also just make things up for dangling plot hooks and answer them later. Basically, the Dawn of Flame adventure path is basically that in a lot of ways. It's like we talk about this, the Lashuntas in Asana Town are psychically on edge. Why is that? Let's answer that question. And we'll basically stuff that we like to do. We give ourselves sort of slack for the future, enough rope to hang ourselves in the future, basically. Before we get on to this other thing that I want to do, we do have some art of different swarm components that I want to take a look at. Let's go to the second one. If that's cool. Yeah.
What was that?
That is a swarm ceratorum. They are also they kind of have a little bit of an illithid look, but they're this art. They're a little bit like more like Mind Reapers plus. They are psychically charged up, but they also have those deadly blades of a Thresher Lord. So they're sort of a double threat. These guys, and you don't want to have to face any of those for sure. Let's see the next one. This is one that's actually, oh god, this is an even tougher one. This one's in Alien Archive 3. This is the Swarm Zursk, which is just one of the highest CR swarm we've presented yet, and they are. I can't quite remember. They also have a bit of they stay behind enemy lines. They're not necessarily going to be on the front lines because they're kind of plotters and spellcasters. But I think we also there's a way that you can get one of their psychic eyes as a piece of gear.
Nice. They also have not quite complete individuality, but sometimes they're doing individual things, I believe. Yes. And then it's like, but even so, even if it seems like, oh, this one thing is doing that, it's doing it because the swarm itself wants it to do that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly.
But they do. I think they're a little bit more solitary or do independent operations.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Let's see the next one. This is the swarm Psychovox. Sort of it's huge. It's the size of a bus. This guy, and what this sort of beetle creature is almost like a telepathic amplifier for the swarm, increasing their swarm mind range. And they kind of use them when they're maybe like after they've taken over a planet, the swarm will sort of pop a couple of these down to sort of make sure that all the swarm on the planet are in contact with one another if they might be spaced out a bit. And they play an important part too that the last adventure of why they're getting bred to help the god host to do what it's trying to do. And it actually is at one point it acts like, because it's the size of a bus, it kind of acts like a vehicle, and there's kind of like a vehicle chase as you're trying to chase this one down when you've got your hover jeeps coming after it. I think I have one more. Here we go. Here's the troops. These are the swarm dredgers in troop form. As you can see, there's a lot of them at once, and they are that's horrifying to look at. It's nightmare inducing.
Yeah.
Say.
Overrunning you
and just crunching on your bones. So one of the things that I had done, I think we're good with the art. One of the things I did the other day, just because around the office, when we were looking at Attack of the Swarm, we sort of tongue-in-cheek called it Swarm Ship Troopers.
Yeah.
Right. So what I did, I went online yesterday and asked a bunch of people to play a little hashtag game with me, Swarm a Movie.
Swarm
a movie. So it's basically replacing a part of the movie with Swarm, and I've got some really good answers from that. A lot of this, I'll be perfectly honest, were my friends and family, sort of, because they're the first people to see my tweets. Oh my god, another 20-some notifications. But we've got some great ones here that I want to read real quick, and then we'll get on to other questions. Oh my god, people would always list them. A fistful of swarms. 10 things I swarm about you. So goofy.
You do a swarm full of dollars.
A swarm full of dollars. Scott Pilgrim versus the Swarm, which would be a pretty exciting adventure. Hold on, there's another good one here. Swarm Angry Men.
Ha.
That's a fun one. There was one that Katina did that was pretty hilarious, and I can't remember it now. I'm gonna find it real quick.
Butch Cassidy and the Swarm Dance Kids.
Swarm Dance Kids. Bridget Jones' Swarm. It was How to Train Your Swarm. That's a good one too.
Yeah.
That's just, if you go out there, you can do a couple of them. I'll just pick another couple more at random that I found here. Cloudy with a Chance of Meat Swarms. There's ones that are just sort of like stupidly fun.
Did we stat up meat swarms in Attack of the Swarm?
No, that's terrible.
Missed opportunity.
Little Swarm of Horrors, which of course is just Swarm. Pauly Shore movie, You're in the Swarmy Now. Some of the people just went full on puns. Fried green swarmados. Eat Swarm Love. I think that one is my one of my. It's basically what they do.
Yes. Well, maybe not the love part.
Maybe not the love part. I did that one already. Fast Times at Swarm on High. Anyway, that's a silly little thing on it to do. So if you go onto hashtag Swarm a Movie on Twitter and look them all up, there's just a pile of them, and you can sure have fun.
The Good, the Bad, and the Swarm.
Good, the Bad, and the Swarm.
Swarm
Good, Bad, and the
Wars.
Swarmy. Weekend at Swarmies.
Oh yeah, Weekend.
Someone just wrote The Breakfast Swarm on Twitch.
Oh, yeah,
That's a good one. That's a pretty good one. Swarm Wars, The Phantom Menace. So yeah, replacing Star with Swar is Swarm can make any old thing work. So let's go to some questions from Twitch. If you have any other questions, pop them in the chat. But we got some ones out there already. We'll answer real quick. Does the AP include any content for encouraging or discouraging the nuke it from orbit strategy of spaceships versus monster combat? Yeah, a lot of the problem is that you don't have that capability right off the bat. You're on the ground and you are just trying to escape. And once you get up to high enough level, there is a sort of like the people when Sub-colon gets sort of overrun. Spoiler alert: the people who want to take it back don't want to nuke their own planet, essentially, right? And have it be a nuclear wasteland afterwards. And then there's basically some of the other things that are happen. You're looking for information on the planet, and there's no reason, if you nuked it, you would probably wipe out all the computers, stuff like that. So yeah, there are a few of those. And we don't necessarily come out right out and say this is why we're not nuking the planet. We're just sort of come out and here are the missions you need to do.
So as lead developer of the Attack of the Swarm adventure path, what was one of your most challenging parts in making that? Was it a dungeon or a creature encounter or something like that?
It was all making. I would say that I'm not necessarily a war movie buff. I like to watch them. I enjoyed Starship Troopers and other types of movies.
Swarm.
The Big Red Swarm, Saving Private Swarmin'. So the challenge.
Swarming Private Ryan.
Swarming Private Ryan. Yes, better. That's much better.
Anyways,
the challenge was sort of like to keep that idea fresh, and that's why this whole thing goes into some, I think, strange places. And we get into Sheeran culture and Sheeran background and Hylaxian and tenets and whatnot. And it's method. So in Volume 5, there's a whole psychic mindscape adventure. And that one let us go a little nuts and bonkers, sort of like go inside the swarm's hive mind. Ooh, it's creepy and weird. And it's like basically invading hostile territory, but in a psychic way. So, I would say that. I can't wait for you to read it all, Rob.
Cool.
I'll ask you this question.
All right.
This. Besides Heinlein, were you inspired by Jack Kirby's humanoid insects known as the Hive and the Parademons to create the Sheerans and the Swarm?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, it's personally, I wasn't. I didn't know about Parademons until much later, like relatively recently. But it's at least at the beginning when we were creating the Starfinder role-playing game, there was a number of people that we're all, and I'm not sure, I think the Sheerans came before the Swarm in our thing, just because we wanted something that was a cool alien, and it's like you don't really get to play insects in a lot of games. And then we just kind of came up with like I said, with this, I think Starship Troopers was a much bigger influence in terms of if we wanted big bugs, and then we connected them to the sheer and everything. But there's so many influences from different places. I'm sure people can bring in some of those own influences into their game, or somebody else on the team may have had that influence.
Yeah, cool. All right, well, let's figure out how are the overall events of this AP going to affect the rest of the timeline. So that's one of the reasons too that I wanted to set this in a new system, right? I didn't want to have this to be Swarm War 2, Electric Boogaloo, basically an attack on the Pack Worlds, because the Pack Worlds and Veskorium already drove them off through sheer military might, and they've got that military might. So I wanted to take this smallish, maybe not as well defended system and wreck the heck out of it. And that's why it takes place in the Sub-colon system, and why because I wanted that first volume, that first adventure to feel like it was a losing battle right off the bat. And how is this going to affect the rest of the system? I mean, that's going to depend on whether or not you play through it or not. We're probably not necessarily going to take out what happens. You don't defeat the Swarm at the end of this, as we've talked about. You defeat the Swarm Sub-colony that's trying to do something very, very bad, which definitely saves the rest of the galaxy. But those repercussions don't necessarily ripple outward unless, you take them for your own home campaign and decide to, we'll take the fight to them now because we know this, that, and the other thing. For the most part, the swarm is still going to be out there. They may get some other plans at some future. The Sub-colon system might show up there. They're friendly with the pack worlds in the Veskarium. They're not a protectorate in any way or a colony of that way. They, if maybe in the future we'll decide that they have a bigger presence here and there. But there's, as systems go, they're a small system. They don't have a ton of habited planets. So, I mean, as creative director who's worked on a lot of adventure paths, how do you feel about when we do an adventure path and how that integrates with the rest of the setting?
We generally don't have it. We generally don't go forward after an adventure path saying that this is what has happened, because we don't want the canon of the game to move beyond, people that might be playing Dawn of Flame or Dead Suns or something right now. And then we say, oh, well, this is what's happened. And then it's like, well, if they want to follow the canon of the setting, they can't play Attack of the Swarm because that's already happened. So we kind of leave that for sort of the individual groups, their games, and what their version of the setting is. And at some point in the future, just with Pathfinder, they recently did this when we did Pathfinder 2nd edition. A lot of the setting got updated based on the results of the adventure pass, because that was a good time to sort of bring those in and bring the setting up. But in general, we're not going off of the things. Maybe at some point down the road we might say, this adventure path assumes that this adventure path already happened, right, but so far we haven't done that. So it's going to kind of happen on its own timeline in your own home campaign, whenever you want to run that.
Awesome. Cool.
Off the top of your head, how many swarm variants are there, Jason?
That's a good question. So we not count, let's sort of set starships aside for now, right? There are 5 in the Alien Archives alone, through Alien Archive 3. There are at least 9. How many 6 times 3? 18. I would say there's about somewhere around the vicinity of 15 to 20 more swarm variants in the whole AP.
Nearly a score.
So all told, we've got nearly a score going on. And that isn't probably just the tip of the swarm bird.
Right, because there's probably thousands of different components that in the galactic scale of the swarm that they have created.
Right.
We just haven't statted up all of those.
Yeah, exactly.
That'd be a lot of.
There'd be a lot, sure. And then there's a few extra, and there's maybe 3 starships, basically 2 or 3 starships. Yeah. Cool. Next question from Nitrace: will there be any connections with the AP through Starfinder Society? And because we sometimes have these thematic overlaps, we haven't talked too much about with SFS about that. And we, since Thurston Hillman wrote Volume 5, he would be the one to know the most about whether or not there's going to be those connections. I think maybe because of that, he may have shied away from it for a bit. But I don't know if you've read some more what's upcoming.
Yeah, there's not too much of that, just because the Starfinder Society tends to have these story arcs that last for a whole season, and because the swarm is such a big threat, for much of the same reason that Jason, you were talking about, that we moved this adventure path outside of the Pact Worlds to a different system. If something like that would likely be the entire season, and of course, since the Starfinder Society is kind of set in the Pact Worlds, although they do go other places, that would be like having the swarm attack the Pact Worlds, which has already happened in history. So there's not a whole lot of, or if any, overlap between the current storylines in Starfinder Society and Attack of the Swarm.
Cool. Can we get the next question there? Let's talk about a little bit about the Sheeran, since they are part of the swarm.
Yeah.
People have been sort of asking about where they are. Are they preferred targets of the swarm since they broke off?
Right.
I think you want to play that how you want to. But they don't. But the swarm don't have grudges per se. I think maybe that's the only thing they might have, if they do have a grudge, is that they want to re-assimilate the Sheerans and make them. It's not so they want to punish them, per se, but maybe they've learned some stuff that the swarm could benefit from eating that DNA.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it's an individual swarm component would target a Sheeran over anything else, because it's all just these are threats that must be destroyed. But maybe it's sort of some kind of subconscious desire on the part of the whole
hive mind.
The whole swarm hive mind. It's Sheerans, we should get them back at some point. But
how dare they?
Minor little subconscious thing.
Right? Yeah. They don't necessarily seek them out. And in terms of what happened, we know why the Sheeran got that independence. this is sort of a thing that is unknown. It's a big unknown because it happened during the gap, and whether or not since the swarm are constantly evolving, there's a chance that something like that could happen again. There's a chance like that something even more like something that just they evolve something that eats them from within. It becomes even like a bigger menace and becomes a bigger threat. So I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon because the swarm we have enough going on with them as it is. But the Shirens themselves have not forgotten about the fact that they know that their history is from the swarm. The second volume has also got another article written by Lou that talks a little about the what I've called the Shiren Exodus. That period of time after they after the end of the gap between when they sort of got some drift travel and started moving around, and when they showed up in the Pact Worlds, which I think is about 60 or 80 years. And so where did they go? What was that time like for them? So we described a little bit of that. That's where they do actually why they're connected to the Sub-colonies system. They sort of made a little stop off. They did a couple other colonies that might be out there that we talk about, but they that article talks about how some Shirens, for instance, there is an institute. I think it's called the Orzaka Institute of Swarm Biology that is mentioned that is mostly Shirens thinking about how do we free the swarm from the tyranny of their own hive mind.
Right.
And so
in
that's
the way the Shirens did themselves.
In the way the Shirens did themselves, right? And they haven't made any progress, so to speak. But that's like a faction out there that you can play with if you want in your game of having, basically maybe working for this institute or whatever. Like go capture some swarm alive and we can figure out how their brains work or that sort of thing. And I think if it comes down to it, it would have to be a sort of a combination of like psychic magic and biology, biochemistry to get them away. I think that I was sort of made me think a little bit about the Borg. And a lot of that Star Trek: The Next Generation plotline, when they sort of like were always sort of butting up against the Borg here and there, and then they got Hugh, who kind of got independence, and they were like, "Well, we could inject Hugh with this virus that would basically render the Borg, unmovable because they're thinking about some sort of crazy math problem or something like that, right?" But then they decided this like it would just be better to just sort of reintroduce that spark of independence back into the Borg, individuality back into the Borg, and indeed, it sort of like has that whole sort of cascading plot line happening on that show. So I think something like that could maybe even happen.
Cool. So each adventure path has its own unique look, right? So what inspired the look of the Tactical Swarm? I know you talked with the art team.
Yes,
and worked
with
that
I talked with Adam Vick on the art team and Sarah Robinson. We talked about what do we want, and we talked about the swarm. Here's a couple. We've already got some good images of the swarm. Here's what they look like. They're buggy, right? So let's have this kind of have an insectile quality. And we got a lot of sketches back, and some of them were just kind of super gross, to be perfectly honest. And if you've got that, I can't remember the exact name of the phobia, but if you have that phobia of tiny holes, like if you like look at a surface that has a bunch of tiny holes in it, that squicks some people out, and that has a name, and I can't quite remember it. But some of the looks of this adventure path, some of the border treatments have these little kind of organic looking tiny holes in the sort of thing that make them look like bug carapaces and whatnot. That might be something you want to keep an eye out for. Maybe just sort of block that part of the page. But originally too there was a lot more like fleshy
trypophobia.
Bug tones. Trypophobia, that's what it is. Thank you, chat. That had a lot more like a fleshier color to it, sort of the first couple passes too, but we decided that was too gross. So we kind of took back and went with this sort of really great like blue, that sort of because the swarm themselves have all these sort of different colorations to them.
True.
Do we have any plans for battling giant bugs in giant mech suits? Now, are the giant bugs in the giant mech suits? Or are we in the giant mech suits battling giant bugs?
This goes back to the question we often get about mechs and everything, and that is, it's something we've talked about putting in the game, and we'd probably like to do at some point, but we don't have plans for battling giant bugs and mechs quite yet. There'll be some giant battles in Attack of the Swarm, but maybe you can get your powered armor. You can kind of get that feeling. The final encounter with the God Host, which is a real bear. I got to tell you, because that thing is big and it is 5 heads. So Attack of the Swarm has a player's guide like built into it,
Sure.
right? So have you gotten any feedback about that, or how do you feel that worked?
I think it worked pretty good. We've gotten just a tiny bit of feedback on the forums, from a couple people who seem to like it, but not like overwhelming one way or the other. So if you do like it, though, I want to hear it. If something that you think we could do better, I'd love to hear that too. Since this took place in a whole new system and had a very sort of thematic tone to it, I wanted there to be some kind of information for the players right off the bat to be like, what is Susclon? What is the Susclon Defense Force? Who is the 5th Battalion? That's who you start basically as part of. And I wanted to make sure that there was that we connected everything to the themes once again, like we usually did at the beginning. It's like, if you're this theme, maybe you're in the army for this reason. Most of this sort of seemed obvious. If you're a soldier, you're this. We added a couple of new themes that were very military focused, so you could actually I'm just a career military person, and that's why I'm in this military. But we also throw in like stuff for like Icon and Xenoarchaeologist and Dream Prophets, some weird ways that you might connect your non-soldiery character to the AP. And I wanted to make sure that make it clear right off the bat, the swarm invasion of Susclon, by the time the PCs have come out, has been occurring for about 6 months. At this point, the military knows that acid weapons don't work against the swarm. So I think your player should know that right off the bat anyway. Fear effects are not going to be super great against the swarm. So maybe don't base your character around that. So those things that we generally put in players' guides to make sure that players don't end up in traps that make the game not fun for them. Yeah.
Cool.
What do you think putting other evil empires against one another? We got a question here saying, would the Aslanti Star Empire do well against the swarm? What about the Dominion of the Black?
That's interesting.
What kind of tactics would they take?
Well, I think that the Dominion of the Black might have the best chance just because they're so widespread. They may even be beyond the bounds of this galaxy. They may be an intragalactic threat, maybe. Or multi-galactic threats. So the Aslanti Star Empire, I don't know. They have multiple star systems under their control, about a dozen of them, I think. So they might take a little bit longer for the swarm to devour them, but
the Aslanti would probably throw all of their quote unquote alien troops first, right?
Undoubtedly.
And then like, you do as best you can, and then oops, that didn't work. We're screwed. Yeah. I think even with all their magitech, the Aslanti wouldn't stand much of a chance.
Unless they were somehow able to divert the swarm away from them and point them toward the Pact World or the Vescarium.
Yeah,
or
they
something.
would do that, wouldn't they?
I mean, there would be no proof of that or anything like that.
You don't know. We've never
that's
heard
an interesting
anything.
thought experiment.
Yeah, exactly. Oh boy. What's another good? I mean, the Cult of the Devourer against the Swarm, they would just sort of bash heads against one another.
Yeah, and the Cult of the Devourer's not organized.
Not even organized. They don't even have territory, so to speak. Yeah. Got another question here. Could psychic species be indoctrinated by the swarm to, say, pave the way for their arrival? That's actually a pretty interesting question, because we kind of touch on that a little bit in the adventure path, because of the psychic abilities of like our player character races like Shirans and Lashuntas. They get a little bit of psychic interference when the swarm hive mind is pretty close. And in fact, in the second volume, there is a sort of fifth column group of agitators on this colony world where all the refugees from Susclon have gone. And that volume has no swarm fights in it, so to speak. But this group who call themselves the Reckoners are like, they're basically getting a little, their minds a little warped by the sort of proximity of the swarm hive mind, and are like, we deserve the swarm. We should welcome our swarm overlords and just lay down our arms and let them eat us, because this is the sins of the sins of our system are such that this is punishment. So you basically have to like stop them from sabotaging all the efforts to protect the refugees and whatnot.
But that's not the swarm purposely doing
the swarm don't.
The swarm doesn't really work with people. I mean, I suppose it might, if you were able to make contact without just being killed, they might do a short-term thing, but they're not really interested in making deals with people. They're interested in growing and expanding and devouring. So
if your interests somehow also aligned with them in that way, like, I want to destroy that planet too, they would work with you, but then they would just turn around and eat you.
Right. And like, rather than indoctrinating a psychic race, they would probably just eat that race and then absorb whatever they needed from their DNA, and maybe make a new swarm component that would give them the capabilities that other species would do.
Yeah. I think we have time for one more question. Scroll. Let me figure that one. Can we make the swarm feel afraid? No, you cannot. We should have mentioned that they do not feel fear. You basically have to shoot them until they die. And that is your only chance of survival. Getting away, I think, is the best bet. If you find yourself up against some swarm creatures, some swarm components, especially an army of them, get the heck out of there. Rob, any final thoughts about the swarm?
I don't think so. I think we've said everything we need to do. They're still, even with this AP, they're still a big threat for the galaxy. So, they're available to use. They may make a reappearance later on, for all that we know.
Yeah,
but yeah,
that's what I say. Yeah, just go out there, check out the Attack of the Swarm Adventure Path. Grab that first volume. See if it's something you like. If that's something your group wants to go through.
Who wrote that first volume?
That first volume was written by Patrick Brennan of Cosmic Chris. Hi, probably over there already in the chat. Hi, Patrick. And check them all out. I think at least all the we haven't got all the covers yet shown on the website, but they'll be coming up pretty soon. And I think you're going to be pretty excited about where this one goes. So that's it from us here on Starfinder Wednesday. Be sure to tune in to our Twitch stream tomorrow for Oblivion Oath if you want to see more of my face and others of course. But we'll be playing some more of Pathfinder 2nd Edition then. Until then, I'll see you there. Keep watching this.
Later.